Okay. I will switch gears a little bit now and talk about neurological conditions. I will just start with 2 or 3 introductory slides because this is not a specialized audience, just to put things in perspective a little bit. So this is the growth of Alzheimer's disease. We are getting more and more cases. This is in the US. Right now, there are about 6 million people with Alzheimer's disease in the United States. The numbers, as you can see, they're expected to grow exponentially. And this is the same for the whole world, and particularly for developing countries where the population is relatively young now, but as they age more and more, the numbers are expected to get higher. So again, this is the cost. This is from the UK. This is the cost of cancer, heart disease, stroke, and dementia. And of course, there's direct cost, and there is indirect cost, which means that, caregivers, family, relatives, friends, they have to care for these people for quite a few years because dementia, the duration of dementia is on average a decade. So you can see that it's a big public health care issue. And then the last introductory slide before going into the Mediterranean diet and the relevant associations. I just want to put the cost in perspective. So this is for the US, and this is $1 billion, okay? So right now, for the US, Alzheimer's disease costs about between 150 and $200 billion every year. So this is the same cost as the war in Iraq. It's exactly the same cost. So if the current trends continue, 2050, it will be more than $1 trillion every year. So in 2050, it would be as if the US, for example, had to fight at the same time 5 or 6 wars like the war in Iraq at the same time. So this is impossible for the US economy to carry, as you realize. It was already difficult with 2 wars happening at the same time. Imagine 6 of them. So, and if the US cannot afford it, imagine the rest of the world. So it's a really big, beyond, humanistic and medical and biological problem, it's a big financial problem. So it's important to try and find, something to prevent this disease since we don't have a cure for it at present. I try to put here in this slide some of the literature relating nutrition, various foods and nutrients with low risk for Alzheimer's disease or cognitive decline. So this is not exhaustive, but just to give you a sense. So if one just looks at this, one may say, oh, great, we have a lot of information, maybe we can recommend certain things and we can decrease the rates of this disease. But the truth is that if one looks at the literature extensively, one can find many negative or neutral studies that include these foods or nutrients that I showed you in the previous slide. So one can choose and pick from the literature and make many arguments, but the truth is that we're not really sure. We're not really sure whether we have good prevention for Alzheimer's disease based on nutrition. So that brings me to the Mediterranean type diet. If you take a notice, many of the nutrients and foods that are included in the previous slides, they were part of what we call the traditional Mediterranean diet. So we decided to investigate this association a few years ago, but we didn't investigate this in a nice Mediterranean island. We investigated this in New York, in Manhattan, because this is where I was and this is where we had the data. So we had there this, it still exists actually, a community-based study, a population-based study, a random sample of elderly, 65 and older. They were assessed very carefully neurologically with neuropsychological testing, and of course we had nutritional assessments. We tried to address this question in this population-based sample in Manhattan. So at a cross-sectional look, just to give you a sense, we used Antonia's score 0 to 9 with a higher number indicating higher adherence. And what we found cross-sectionally was that people with Alzheimer's disease had lower scores compared to people who were non-demented. But of course, the most important information came from the prospective data. So in these analyses, we have about 2,200 subjects who were followed for an average of 4 to 5 years. And we had 230 approximately incident cases of Alzheimer's disease. So here we were able to I'm sorry, but it goes forward by itself. We had 230 incident cases, so we were able to relate dietary adherence at baseline with risk for developing Alzheimer's disease during follow-up. And these are the results. There was breaking down the score into tertiles. There was a significant decreased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease for those who were closer to a Mediterranean-type pattern. When we looked at individual foods or nutrients, the association was related to alcohol and vegetables. But then these were unadjusted models. When we used the fully adjusted models, we couldn't identify even any of the individual components, which again, raises the issue of, of synergies and interactions and the benefits that dietary patterns have compared to looking at individual foods or nutrients, which may have been missed if we had not looked at the pattern in these data. Then we proceeded a little bit to look at the relation of this diet with mild cognitive impairment. What is mild cognitive impairment? What happens in this condition, we have dementia here at the end, and we have normality here. But in between dementia and normality, we have this intervening period, this gray zone here of mild cognitive impairment, where there's already change in biomarkers, but the clinical, the functional abilities are still unimpaired, but we already see changes in the brain in biomarkers. So mild cognitive impairment is this gray zone where somebody is not completely normal, but again, he's not, that person is not as bad to be called demented. So it's a great area of research in the field because it could be subjects, they could form subjects for intervention because they are before they develop the actual disease. So we wanted to look at this, at the association of Mediterranean-type diet with mild cognitive impairment. So in initial analysis, we had people who were completely normal at baseline, and then we related adherence to a Mediterranean-type diet with incident development of mild cognitive impairment over a follow-up of 4.5 years. And we found something similar to what I showed you for Alzheimer's disease before. So starting from a completely normal state, it decreases the risk of developing even mild cognitive impairment. And then we asked the question, okay, let's say you already are in this gray zone, you already have mild cognitive impairment. Does adherence to this diet relate to protection from going to the next step, which is the dementia step? Again, you can see the numbers here, similar follow-up. It was roughly similar associations. Even the middle tertile here was quite protective. So then I'm trying to go a little bit fast to, to keep the 25 minutes. But so then we asked the question, okay, there seems to be some protection in terms of developing cognitive problems. But what about if you already have dementia? Does it make any difference? It's similar to the previous talk, to when the question was asked, what if you already have diabetes? Does it make any difference in the management? So it's a similar question. So here we had approximately 200 subjects who already had Alzheimer's disease, and we assessed their adherence to the diet, and we related to different outcomes. So here is survival. This is not cognition, and we found a difference in survival. 6.6 years, very prominent, 7.9 years, 10 years in the three tertiles of adherence to a Mediterranean diet. Of course, this is not surprising since, the mortality effect has been shown in the general population in other, disease subgroups, but we see it in Alzheimer's disease. But we did not see in this study, we did not see any association with rates of cognitive decline or functional decline. So what we have from this study is that after the disease starts, the clinical manifestation of the disease, because the biological disease starts very earlier, but the clinical manifestations, when they start, irrespective of diet, there doesn't seem to be something that can slow down and improve your prognosis. So maybe there's some room for prevention, but not so much for prognosis. And that's a similar story also with medications that have been tried for Alzheimer's disease, because one of the reasons that maybe these medications have failed is that maybe they are tried very late when the disease has already started and it's impossible to reverse the process. So that takes me to the second part of the talk, biological mechanisms. So this is not, again, an exhaustive list of biological mechanisms that may relate diet with risk for Alzheimer's disease. Vascular mechanisms, stroke, oxidative stress, inflammatory mechanisms, metabolic mechanisms. One could add here amyloid-related mechanisms, tau-related mechanisms, and so forth. It would be a very big slide. But there are many possibilities, and of course, they're not mutually exclusive. So we started exploring a little bit these associations. I will focus more on the Mediterranean diet rather than individual foods or nutrients. So we had an initial study trying to address the issue of metabolic and inflammatory pathways, because we know that the Mediterranean diet is relating to these factors, and there's literature that inflammation and insulin metabolism and diabetes-related metabolic changes may relate to Alzheimer's disease. So we addressed it in a mediation type of model. So here we had the diet and risk for Alzheimer's disease in an initial simple model. And then we included CRP, insulin and adiponectin measured from serum as mediating variables. So in theory, if the association is through these biomarkers, then the association should disappear when we include these mediators. So it's a little bit complex slide, but I will make it quite simple. So this is the change of the coefficient, the change of the relation between Mediterranean diet and Alzheimer's disease when we include the different biomarkers. So when we include CRP, for example, you can see that the coefficient changed by 1%, 1.3%. When we include insulin, again, a similar thing. And to make a long story short, when we included all the three biomarkers, insulin, adiponectin, and CRP, the change was really nothing. It was less than 1%. So from these analyses, we didn't see any mediation from inflammatory or metabolic pathways. But again, there are a lot of limitations because CRP, I mean, the inflammatory pathway has many, many different biomarkers. Maybe with just CRP, we didn't capture the whole inflammatory pathway, right? And similarly with insulin and adiponectin. So there are a lot of limitations, but at least, at this first look, we didn't see this, these mediating mechanisms. What about vascular? I spend a little bit more time here because it relates also to the previous topics. So there is, I think, I will show you a few studies that relate Mediterranean diet with stroke. I think there's pretty good evidence. So this is from, this is from Boston, 75,000 women, 70,000, and 6 assessments, 20 years of follow-up, 1,763 incident cases of stroke. There was a clear association between Mediterranean diet and risk for incident stroke in this very big study. So then this is a study by Antonia's group a year ago approximately from the EPIC data, 23,000 subjects, 10 years of follow-up, approximately 400 incident stroke cases. And there was an association showed. It was more prominent. There was a protection for stroke, more prominent for women and ischemic stroke, mostly driven by vegetables, legumes, and olive oil. And this is actually the actual results. You can see approximately for 2 years increment of Mediterranean type diet adherence, approximately a 15% reduction in risk. And of course, I think the strongest data come from the Predimed trial because it's an interventional study, right? So I don't need to, to bring howls in Athens here, right? To repeat about the Predimed study, but I want to draw your attention here. I mean, we have here the primary endpoint. If we look at the secondary endpoints, a big part of the effect is driven by stroke, actually. So stroke was, I think, the strongest effect of the Mediterranean diet. Very significant, and it was a big part of the whole, the total, cardiovascular effect that was seen. So very strong evidence. It's an interventional study, and stroke is very prominent in the global outcome, more prominent than other outcomes like MI, death from cardiovascular causes, death from any causes. It's really stroke. We tried to address also these data. We didn't have such big number of incident cases, but we had some biomarker data. So this is the NOMA study. It's a very famous study that looks into into risk factor epidemiology for stroke. Again, it's a random sample of the community in northern Manhattan in New York, and we had about close to 1,000 subjects with brain MRI. And in the brain MRIs, we're able to measure these white matter hyperintensities, these white stuff that you see here that we don't see in younger people, we see as people grow older. Some people, the pathology is not absolutely clear, but there's connection with vascular comorbidity, and to a certain degree they could be considered as representing subclinical infarcts. and we can measure them in the MRI. So what we showed really in this study was that there was an association of adherence to Mediterranean white matter hyperintensities in the brain. So now with lower numbers, because we have a biomarker of vascular injury in the brain, we can see the association. It was driven mostly from the ratio of monounsaturated to saturated fatty acids, which is, I guess, the closest to olive oil in this data. And then we looked at another sign of vascular injury in the brain, what we call infarcts. This is from our study, from the study that looks into aging and dementia. Again, we had about 750 subjects with brain MRIs, and approximately 25 to 30% of these subjects have infarcts in their brain, and they do not know about these infarcts. They never perceived these infarcts as strokes in their life. This is a very common thing. When we do MRIs, we see strokes in people's brains, and people didn't realize that they had a stroke because they didn't feel it in their life, because often they are small. These infarcts are small, they're asymptomatic, but sometimes they can be large, and people may still not be able to perceive it during their life. So it's a very sensitive biomarker of strokes in the brain. And again, what we saw in this study was a relation of Mediterranean-type diet with less risk for infarcts in the brain MRIs. You can see here the tertiles and how the possibility of infarcts goes down. And, and if one looks at the numbers, actually, these are different models adjusted for different things, but it's roughly, for the highest tertile, the possibility of a brain infarct was low, approximately 35%. So it was a strong association. So it seems that vascular pathways is a good candidate for the relation of Mediterranean-type diet with dementia. And maybe vascular comorbidities relate to risk for Alzheimer's disease. But what about replication? I think it's good to be quite complete when we look at the literature. So there have been studies, after our initial study in 2006 that look at the relation of the diet with Alzheimer's disease and cognition. So these are studies that did not see any association of Mediterranean diet with cognition. I think there are limitations in many of the studies in that either there's a limited cognitive assessment or there's only a single assessment, or subjects could be very young, 66. You don't expect to see significant cognitive decline over a short follow-up if you're 66, so there's no power to detect. But from the nurses' health study and the women's health study, there was some association cross-sectionally, but it was not confirmed longitudinally. So there have been, negative studies in terms of the relation of Mediterranean diet with cognition. And of course, there have been also positive studies that replicate, what we have seen. I will show you a little bit about these studies. This is the 3-city study in France. And there was a significant association between adherence to Mediterranean-type diet and risk for cognitive decline. There was not enough power for dementia, but it was a positive study, and it's closer to a Mediterranean population. Although it's mostly the Bordeaux data, not really Mediterranean, but closer to our region. And then this is from Chicago. This is an important study. It's because it's a lot of African Americans and whites. And it's about 3,500 subjects, long follow-up, a very good group. Interestingly, there was no association in this study between the health index that is recommended by the US Department of Agriculture and rates of cognitive decline, but there was for the Mediterranean-type diet. So they compared these two dietary patterns, and they did see an effect for Mediterranean diet, but not for the health eating index. And then a more recent study from the REGARD study, very big, 17,000 participants. It's focused mostly on stroke, but they had also data on cognitive impairment. And they did see an association of the diet, of Mediterranean-type diet. It's in many areas of the US with risk for cognitive impairment, and it was more prominent actually to non-diabetics. But there was an association in diabetics too. And we tried to do a meta-analysis. It didn't include all of these studies because you have to put a stop point in the meta-analysis recently. And for stroke, in our data, we had significant associations. It was very detailed meta-analysis. And again, for cognitive impairment, there was a significant association. One tried to combine all the studies in a very rigorous methodology. So then that brings to the second issue, the healthy person bias or residual confounding. And one issue that has been raised in relation to our studies is physical activity, because there are a lot of data that physical activity, healthy lifestyle in general, but physical activity in particular, may be related to low risk for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So one question was, okay, could it be that these people are just, more active in their exercise or different active lifestyle that could be responsible for the associations? So we tried to look at this in our data, and what we found was that there was an independent association between physical activity and Mediterranean type diet. So you see here for diet and here for physical activity. So the association was over and above each other, and of course these models are adjusted for caloric intake on the diet aspect, and they're adjusted for BMI on the physical activity aspect. So it seemed like an independent association, and actually when we combined these two indices together, you can see how you can see in tertiles. So these are the people in so these are the people who are the lowest tertile for physical activity, completely inactive, and we're following the diet that is the further possible, has the further possible distance from Mediterranean diet principles. And then you can see intermediate groups, and these are at the highest tertile for both diet and physical activity. And the numbers are, for this group, the protection. It's an observational study, but the protection was, approximately 60% or 65% when people were both exercising and following a healthy diet. And the last thing that I'm going to finish with this, not to go over time, is the issue of observation versus randomization. This is the major issue. Most of the studies that I showed you so far are observational studies. In terms of randomized study, that's the big question here. The only one is the Predimed trial. There was this publication in JNNP, and of course it's a small subset of the Predimed trial. There are limitations in that, as you can see, it's around 200 or 150 in each group, because it's only a small subset. I think it's the Navarra subset, I think. So it's not the full 7,500 people. And also there was the disadvantage of a single cognitive assessment. Of course, at baseline, due to randomization, you can assume that all groups would be equal also in cognitive performance. But it's hard to know for sure. So what was the association? In this subset of the Predimed trial, there was a protection in terms of mini-mental. On average, just to give you a sense, there was a difference of half a point of mini-mental. This is a scale between 0 and 30. So there was a difference of half point in the 0 to 30 scale between those that were following a Mediterranean type diet versus those that were at the controlled diet in favor of the Mediterranean diet. But again, it was assessed once only. But it's a hint of a positive signal in cognition from a randomized trial. And I'm very happy to hear that in the Predimed 2, you will include also some outcomes for neurodegenerative diseases, and I assume you may have repeated cognitive assessments. So we may be able to get a more, a more complete answer on this. And I think it's an important gap in the literature, and we should try to address it, maybe using some biomarkers, because it's very difficult to do big randomized trial in this population. It's not, I think in myocardial infarction and diabetes, it's a little bit easier. Here, they need to be very long trials, huge numbers, very costly, and it's not so easy because we don't have a good biomarker for this condition. And I think, so this remains a question, and I think I will end here, and thank you for your attention.